everybody. I am Courtney Beasley. I'm going to be your moderator today, and we really thank you for taking your time and spending this time with us. We're going to keep things practical today. Our goal is to help you see influence in potentially a little bit of a new light. It's not necessarily a vanity concept, but something that you can design, measure, and use to build confidence in those high stakes decisions that we know all of our buyers, of course, are faced with. So we're going to ground us with just a simple definition. I pulled this from Webster's. I thought it was such an interesting approach to influence. And it's defined as influence is the act or power of producing an effect without an apparent exertion of force or direct exercise or command. So in other words, influence is what moves people without pushing them. And in B2B, when decisions are being made at high stake risk and that capacity all the time, that quiet ability to move an opinion and build that confidence is absolutely everything. So really the question becomes, how do you control something that is so inherently invisible and intentionally effortless? So in the state of B2B today, in influence, it's trust is a primary driver of reputation. It's built over time and through consistency, authority, likability, and of course, social proof. That part hasn't changed, but what has changed is the environment around it. It's the context that we're trying to build of what influence that looks really different today than it did even a few years ago. So what is different today? AI has accelerated content volume. Everyone can publish more and even faster. Buying groups are larger, 6 to 8 to 10 plus people are forming any point of view from different sources when making those buying decisions. Information is absolutely everywhere. Buyers are educating themselves on their own along their path to making a buying decision. And you don't always control all of those factors of how they're interacting and understanding your brand. And decision cycles are longer. Stakeholders can be more skeptical, which ultimately pushes those decisions to take a longer time. So put together, credibility is harder to earn, can be easier to lose. And influence isn't about just one moment. It's about that pattern of signals that people are seeing over time and ultimately where they're deciding to build that trust. So this is how we're thinking about influence, and these are some of the components of that we're going to focus on today and focus our time. So how modern influence is informed in the B2B space, where influence signals strength or weakens across teams or channels, the role of innovation in AI and shaping modern influence, and then designing and measuring that at scale. So understanding how you can control some of those touch points in between the decision. I am joined today by an expert group, all that we are very lucky to have here within our walls at Highwire, who are seeing this in action every single day on the clients that they, get the chance to partner with. So I will go around and just introduce everyone quickly, but you'll get to hear from them, for our entire time. So Denny Maeo, he runs our corporate reputation practice. Rebecca Crispin is our EVP of Integrated Solutions. James Holland is our EVP of Integrated Strategy, and Reed Hanley is our EVP of Innovation. And so they will be here sharing their perspectives based on each of the sections and categories that we're going to go through today, as mentioned. So ultimately kicking off with section 1, how are B2B buying decisions shaped by influence today? We're going to kick off with a poll, so we can go ahead and get that launched. Awesome. So the question in front of you is, what is your biggest challenge in building and managing B2B influence today? Measuring in a meaningful way, aligning stakeholders and marketing comms and executives, breaking through content fatigue and noise, translating reputation into pipeline impact, or keeping pace with AI and digital shifts. We'll give it just a minute. More than half of you have already responded, so thank you for that. Understanding this will also help us to kind of frame some of the context in which we will cover today. Awesome. We can go ahead and end the poll. So what we see on, gosh, it really is, I don't think you guys are able to see this on your side, but it really is, I think I can share it. There we go. It's kind of flat across the board, except for keeping pace with AI and digital shifts. So I want to know all of your tips and tricks because we're figuring that out too. Measuring influence in a meaningful way, of course, is one of the higher, coupled with breaking through content fatigue and noise. So really helpful for us in understanding how to shape some of our conversation today. So with that, we are going to kick off. Wait, let me see. Can I get out of this one? Perfect. Okay, so James, I'm going to ask you the first question. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can see your face. James, what has fundamentally changed about how influence is formed today in B2B?
It's a good question. I don't think the answer is unique to B2B, but it definitely pulls through. I think the thing that we see most often is that, attention and therefore influence is increasingly diffused, right? It's spread across a whole bunch of different ecosystems. We all grew up, I feel like, learning about the peso model. That is dust, history. It's so much more than those four categories now. It's been expanded and augmented by all sorts, right? Social is not one thing anymore. It's owned, it's influenced, it's shared, some of it's paid. It's not clean anymore. There are no simple buckets and categories, and even earned media and PR is increasingly fragmented by subscription-based channels like Substack or YouTube, where those authoritative media voices now have other places to play and take their audiences elsewhere. There are only so many hours in a day that an audience can spend on content or receiving messages. It is harder fought than ever, and every day we see a new channel. Could be Threads or Blue Sky or the growth of Reddit. Although I saw Reddit ads slowed down in their last earnings this week, or Discord. Right, age gating aside, Discord is a huge channel, and increasingly hard to measure and listen to. And then there's AI, and it has taken over from search, arguably, as the gatekeeper of recommendation. It used to be that you would fight for that top spot on the first page of a SERP. Now it's fighting for a recommendation from a faceless AI that actually knows more about you because you've been talking to it for months than Google can from just your snapshots of search history. So fragmentation, that has, I think, changed how influence is formed. But there are answers in there, right? There are answers around, well, you can't be everywhere at once, but what you can be is consistent, and you can be early, and
Yes.
you can prioritize understanding your audience more than ever and getting more personal than ever. You mentioned um, buying groups are bigger than ever. That's true, but it also means they're more subjective than ever because everyone has their own biases. We need to get personal and understand the makeup of that buying group and appeal to every single person within it on a almost a one-to-one basis while being consistent. So that kind of fragmentation, but also personalization, I think are the two main challenges that we think about. It's not enough to have an earned strategy, social strategy, content strategy. You arguably need to go beyond an audience strategy too and into an influence strategy.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think that fragmentation is such a key component. And actually, Rebecca, I'm curious where you think organizations are unintentionally weakening that influence across teams and channels based on how many they have to manage now.
Yeah, well, if I zoom out and look at this at the organizational level, influence weakens when there's no shared operating system for the story. So most companies don't have a messaging problem, they have a coordination problem. So when you think about it, brands owns positioning, product owns roadmap messaging, comms owns visibility, sales owns revenue conversation. But no one truly owns the narrative across the full buyer journey. And that part is really important. It matters because influence is happening long before the engagement. Research from Sixth Sense shows 95% of cases, buyers purchase from a vendor that was on their list from day one on that short list. So if an organization isn't aligned early, you may not even get on that list. And we know how important it is to be in that consideration set. So if you add to that fact that buying groups, and James made this point, are larger and more internally validating, that becomes incredibly important. Forrester reported that 94% of buyer groups are six or more, or larger groups than that, even, especially when you get to the enterprise level. and that larger groups improve decision-making confidence. It makes a lot of sense, right? You have a room of people who are validating the decision you're looking to make. But that also means that inconsistencies don't just get noticed, they become a point of debate in those rooms where credibility comes into question. So the real weakness isn't solely in the messaging, it's in the lack of shared ownership, governance, and narrative infrastructure across those teams. Influence weakens when it isn't architected. And that's something we have to do right from the start and establish that ownership of the narrative in that whole journey.
Yeah, absolutely. The narrative component is so incredibly important and getting everyone aligned around that narrative. So I'm curious, Danny, from a reputation perspective, where do trust gaps tend to surface when influence isn't working?
Well, you immediately start to see it in the media landscape, obviously. And as James mentioned, the media landscape is much more fractured, diverse, and all comprehensive, if you will. So as you start to see clinks in the armor, if you will, the way that media perceive your brand and the way that they start to cover you, you immediately start to see that. Beyond media, you start to hear a drift, or you may start to perceive drift with regard to how analysts are perceiving your organization, with how stakeholders are perceiving and are talking about and are, again, bringing your organization forward in conversations. Employee audience is incredibly important here. Their perception starts to crack, if you will, and starts to show inconsistency. Taking a step back, though, I would say that overall, that sort of trust and authenticity associated with your brand, that is a very tangible, even though it's an intangible concept, if you will, with regard to trust and authenticity, it is very tangible when you actually start to talk about how you are perceived amongst media, amongst stakeholders, amongst employees, amongst analysts. There are very specific directional clues and cues that you start to see when those clinks in the armor start to appear. So as far as managing that, it goes back to the tried and true strategic communication strategy, which is trust, authenticity, agility, and consistency. And I think so many brands, particularly right now in this very fractured and very noisy geopolitical landscape, can lose sight of that. It's very easy to become distracted when the news cycle has gone from a 24-hour news cycle, which 10 years ago was considered quite dramatic, to a every 10 minutes, the news cycle is dramatically changing, and brands having to figure out where and when to stay consistent, specific to that news cycle and how it affects their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to mention we do have time for Q&A at the end. So if anyone has questions, feel free to share them in the chat or ask the questions throughout, and we'll make sure that we are fielding those at the end. But I think, James, you may have an example for us around client work that you had conducted specific to
Yeah, enough theory. Let's talk
yeah.
about some real work. We are not going to name the client in this instance, but I can tell you all about them. They're a household name, but they're a household name for a very specific reason in the consumer space. We helped them a couple of years ago start on this journey, and we still work with them today at a greater scale, building out their first B2B platform. It was a situation that's kind of interesting because everything that brought you to this point is no use anymore. You are suddenly speaking to a completely different audience. And in fact, some of those preconceptions from the B2C space may run counter to what you need to now message as a B2B entity. So we did exactly what we've just been espousing. We started with the audience. What do we know about those buyers? To Rebecca's point, they are going to compare notes, and they may have misconceptions based on the old reality. So how can we counter those? Who are they? What are they? What are their pressures? What do they currently believe? And then we worked on demonstrating ways to show up to them with a real crisp focus on relevance. That could be to a challenge or a headache they have, could be to a key moment in time that's unique to that buyer. And it might not be that organization, it might be that buyer within the organization. So, in a B2B world, maybe it's annual planning or budgeting. That doesn't exist really in the consumer world, but it does exist over in B2B. Or it could be compliance or procurement challenges. Again, completely different audience, completely different lens. And how we did it was we moved this company from just being a vendor to being a partner. And a partner is helpful in more ways than you pay them for. They are full of advice or examples or inspiration and resource. So that was where we focused on making this brand useful first and then valuable as a second shoe and a fast follow. And the ways we did it, like I said, we started out with some of the earned and announcements, and then rapidly layered in things like content, lifecycle marketing across email and landing pages, social. There's exec thought leadership in there, and then data-driven storytelling. What can we tell? What can we tell the audience based on what we see the audience doing? So we could predict B2B trends because we have B2B data. Really helpful. And again, it feeds back into that cycle of how well can you know the audience and how useful can you be to them. And then there are some helpful results. I think Courtney said this at the very outset. Influence is about effect. What can we affect? And for us, we have some really straightforward, commercial goals. We need revenue. We need to prove that this B2B platform works and grows. Aside from that, we could see engagement, right? We've got click-through and open rate baseline from B2C. Let's see how we can beat it from B2B. And that number is just ridiculous. And it only comes from being really relevant. You don't open an email that isn't for you. And you can't lead with a buy one get one free or a consumer style offering. So we had to be very crisp and very surgical about that life cycle marketing. And we saw it in unsubscribe rates as well, which of all of the numbers on here is my favorite because I love unsubscribing from junky marketing. And we saw a 40% reduction again in the rates that we could compare from the other side of the house. And again, it's another indication that we are being more relevant. We are cutting through to the audience's need, and we're showing up with value because they're opting in by virtue of not unsubscribing and opening and clicking through more. And happy to answer questions as well, like Courtney said, if you want to pile them into the chat box.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an exceptional example. And exactly to your point, James, some interesting ways that you can measure how that influence is being received, on the effect end, as you mentioned, because as you get these types of results, that's how you know that influence is in the place and space that you are hoping that it's landing. So thank you for the example. Great. We're going to move into our second section, why consistency matters more than content volume. I think this is so intrinsically important today, especially as content and I'm not saying good content, but the amount of content that you can create, the quantity over quality is abounding, and it's at all of our fingertips. And so, this component obviously is immensely important in how our message is received. We can go ahead and launch our next poll, which is, when it comes to content and messaging, what is your biggest challenge right now? So again, when it comes to content and messaging, what is your biggest challenge right now? We produce a lot of content, but the story isn't consistent. We don't produce enough content to stay visible. Our story changes by channel, website versus our sales versus how our execs are talking about things. You're talking a little bit about that in the story narrative and how it breaks down. It's hard to keep up with AI content sprawl, and we're not sure what's actually influencing buyers. So we'll give it a couple more seconds. All right, great. I'll go ahead and end it. So 33% of you said we produce a lot of content, but the story isn't consistent, and we're not sure what's actually influencing buyers. So those two things are likely very related. You're not exactly sure what's working, and so you keep throwing out different messages to see what's going to stick. And then the other two, actually, no one said anything about the AI content sprawl. So I'm really curious about this audience's familiarity with AI and how you're utilizing it with both of those responses. But we don't produce enough content to stay visible, and our story changes by channel. Those were both at 17%. So we can get into this section, and Reed, I'm excited to kick off with you. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing this one as well. Why does consistency matter more than ever when the sheer output of content in this AI accelerated environment we're living in?
So I feel like we have to go back to your first poll before we talk about this
Yeah,
question, because I
fair.
think I wrote it down. Only 7% said that they're keeping pace with AI, which means it was like the bottom last
Yeah, yeah,
ranked.
yeah.
And I feel like I should flag that it should be the first ranked in this particular moment in time, because there's this almost counterintuitiveness to the question around consistency and volume. Because I do think with the proliferation of AI tools, I was telling my husband this morning, the number of AI tools is like laundry. There will always be more laundry and more tools. And I think the problem that I'm certainly seeing from my lens is that you have um, a number of folks that are in a really interesting position as a CMO or a CCO, because arguably you have the most creative license to play with some of these new tools, even in a highly regulated space. You can kind of explore more so than maybe some other departments across your organizations. And yet there's a little bit of this like more is more analysis paralysis barrier that's preventing people from actually using the tools to their advantage. The reason why I think it matters so much in this particular context is in a world in which consistency matters, because people have very minimal to no attention spans and they're being spammed by just think about the notifications that the people on this call currently have popping up while we're having the webinar. There's just like a wide need to have consistency, but that does not mean the same thing as volume. Because then I think one thing that's been particularly interesting over the last 6 months, I've seen more and more buyers are building that filter for AI slop and understanding like this doesn't really feel like it's being written by a human. This doesn't necessarily feel like it's got the strategic wherewithal that would make me think that I'm buying from an organization that really understands my problems and my issues and where I need to be able to meet the needs of my own clients and customers and buyers. So one thing that we've been talking about internally that I think is really good. So James, you sort of touched on it a little bit. So feel free to come off of mute around. We have to start with audience intent and like, what is the insight that we have? And then how are we actually using tools to tell the story and create the content in a way that's going to make the most sense in an era in which none of us have the degree of time to be able to have that like deep dive zoom in opportunity that a lot of people are hoping for. So I kind of bringing it back to your question, I think the real question is almost, is the proliferation of AI forcing us to actually make our brand harder to understand rather than easier? And how do we think about that from a content standpoint? So like getting off of the philosophical approach for a second, one of the ways that I'm a frameworks person. The frameworks that have stuck with me the most in the last like 2 to 3 years, I would say, are ABCDE. Always start with your audience. What's the behavior you're trying to influence? What's the actual message that's going to influence those things, not what you want to say on behalf of your brand? What are the specific channels that are going to be most resonant, which is like, go back to A, understand where your audiences show up. And then E, how are you evaluating that specific approach so that you can understand what's working, what's not working? Because I think that measurement piece that people were voting on is so important. The other framework I will say that I think is helpful for people on the call, like AI is not bad when it comes to content. Like you have to use it in the right way. And that means you have to bookend it with the like real investing and giving a tool, whatever tool you're using, the right feedback up front. That doesn't mean becoming a prompt engineer, but you have to actually increasingly think like a product manager, and also borrow all of the tools you've used as leaders over your career in terms of how do you give people feedback? How do you actually like articulate what it is you need? And that exercise of spending time up front and really clarifying what's the goal of this particular piece of content in this particular channel and what's the right strategic intent, then AI can do 80% of the work. But then you also have to come in at the end and ask the strategic questions around, is this actually good writing? Is this actually going to resonate in the channel where it needs to go? Does this actually solve a question that our buyers would have at any point on the decision journey? And so all of these things are really interesting for us to navigate as marketers and communicators, and as creatives too. But I think just going back to that data point, like I really hope that the 7% becomes like 77% by the end of this call, because otherwise I think we're going to be in bigger trouble in the next 6 to 12 months.
I'm
That's
gonna
my
take you
prediction.
up. I'm gonna take you up on the opportunity to weigh in because you make a really good point about the tools are like laundry. There will always be more. I'm old enough. I know I have some sort of smoothing filter applied, but I'm old enough to remember when the UK, where I'm from, launched its fifth TV channel. Fifth.
Oh my gosh.
What happens when you have a proliferation of choice is the audience self-selects. They segment themselves. Did TV advertising have a catastrophe and a crisis when more channels arrived? No. What you actually found was a more granular choice of where you can meet people because they will self-select into daytime over here or news junkies over there. That's awesome. And the same is happening with digital channels, and the same is happening with AI proliferation. So I would say, similar to Reed, embrace the laundry, right? There is a good side to this
Just play.
this
You got to
this
play with the tools.
overwhelming, yeah, play, learn from the noise because there is learning in there. It's not all chatter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to piggyback off of that, Rebecca, from an over-indexing from a content meets channels, right? I mean, that's ultimately where the strategy comes to life, where your content is living. Where are you seeing potentially brands over-indexing their use of AI in content creation and where they're amplifying that through their channels?
Well, I think what we're seeing is, it goes back to earlier we talked about internal alignment, but what we're seeing is we have to consider the buyer's perspective and how they're looking at the totality of your brand and how they're piecing it together. Everyone has kind of touched on this on the call in a couple different ways, but fragmentation shows up when different touch points tell slightly different stories or different versions of who you are, which can happen easily again with an over reliance on AI without human in the loop. Asking those strategic questions, making sure the essence and heart and soul of the brand is there. But when you think about it, your website might emphasize innovation. Well, earned media may talk about growth. Your executives might be focused on transformation, and sales, they're adapting it because they need to close the deal. So it's a lot like I think about it, how you experience this in real life. So I may know my friend Vicky as a person that I ski with or paddleboard with. And when I think about how she shows up on the mountain or on the water, it's in a certain way. Now at work, I know she's probably a little bit different. She shows up as a different version of herself. And when we travel, I mean, everyone's different when they travel. The same is true there. But the essence of who she is remains the same. So brands work in a very similar way. Each piece may make sense on its own, but for buyers, they're stitching it together. And now AI is also. So when you think about some of the facts and figures we see in the market, like 94% of buyers are using AI during their buying process. So you have to be considering how that all is being stitched together. We focus a lot on this with our clients right now. And AI chatbots, G2 shared number one source of influencing vendor shortlists. AI chatbots. So those inconsistencies don't just confuse buyers, but they get amplified in the results and in the places where they're looking. So some of the common fragmentation points I see are campaign churn. You think about probably, it's true for probably most folks in our audience. I know we can think about this for our clients as well. Teams default to quarterly or launch driven or product launch driven campaigns, each with its own messaging, visuals, and proof points. Individually, they can be really strong, but the buyers they don't experience your company as just who you are on social or just who you are in that moment. They're looking at that continuous narrative and how you show up over time, how you interact with them, even from your support to the messaging you put out to whether or not you respond to them in certain situations. And when campaigns change too often, the story resets instead of building momentum. So that leaves that fragmented impression. And we need to stitch that all together with consistency. We also see at times, especially in this economy, sales is really driven under pressure. So they may adapt the messaging, and this isn't a bad thing, but they may adapt it for specific deals, especially in late stage negotiations. And without that shared messaging spine, bringing it all together, that can become subtle inconsistencies. So the larger the buying group, I touched on this earlier, those deviations can be amplified and turn into a credibility issue. The other thing that comes up a lot, and James touched on how there's so many different channels and so many different places to be, it can be tempting to feel that being omnipresent is the goal. I need to be everywhere that they are. It's really important that you focus in on doing things well and having that center of gravity of what your story will be and being selective, layering in. We do a lot of audience research for our clients to understand where is the precise place they need to be to have the greatest impact, because they don't need to do everything. Not every brand needs to be on TikTok, and that's okay. You can see James doing his dance on your free time. You don't have to do it for brand. But it's important to weigh what's really going to move your audience. And influence is built by coherence and repetition across the right channels, not by your volume alone. And that's really tempting in our current environment to make it just a volume game. We still have to use that lens of strategic thinking around where to be and why. Because the reality is that buyers don't just remember campaigns, they recognize patterns. And if that pattern isn't clear, trust can slow down. you know, I think about Vicky. I know who she is at her core, and that is what makes her my friend and someone I trust. You want the same to be true for your brand, that they know at your core that you're consistent and they internalize that story naturally, and that influence compounds over time.
Yeah, that's such a great response. Thank you. And it really tees up for Danny, I think, in a great way from a corporate reputation perspective. What happens when to a brand when the content volume is growing faster than the narrative consistency, especially when the brand is under more scrutiny from all of their audiences involved, the media, boards, employees, big customers. So all of those things that Rebecca just shared, from consistency and volume, really bringing that to what's at stake here.
I think Rebecca really nailed it, right? She spoke quite a bit about consistency and about fragmentation, and that is the biggest challenge that you see. And we're seeing it happen again. Back to my earlier point on the intense geopolitical environment. Every industry across, and to James's earlier point, it's not just B2B. Every industry is bombarded now with the current news cycle, with the current geopolitical news cycle, with regard to whether they're a regulated industry or non-regulated industry across the board. So what we're seeing is a lot of scrambling to repair reputational damage, potentially done by the very dramatic shift in the news cycle. And what can happen there is any company or any brand is going to be really focused on the biggest wound in the moment, right? If their reputation has been wounded, obviously you need to over-index and fix it, and that is best practice. But the byproduct of that is often an over indexing on focusing on that. And where do we land? Inconsistency, right? So to Rebecca's point, your audiences are consistently hearing the reputation around one particular subject or one particular issue, and their perception starts to change. So I would say, the going back to the best practice, the consistent and authentic and trust-driven overall narrative is the holy grail. And anything that takes you away from that at any given moment is bit by bit, or sometimes dramatically, eroding from the confidence and eroding from that positioning that you have in the market. You start to see it again. I think Rebecca Reed and James all made this point. A division or too much diversity with regard to who is telling your story, whether it be employees, stakeholders, spokespersons, key audience, targets. If and when they start to your question, if they're overstimulated, if you will, with too much content that is not cohesive, they're going to be telling different stories across the board. And so it's a challenge that every brand is facing right now. And I think recentering oneself around that cohesive, authentic, trust-driven narrative is very much easier said than done, but is our jobs as professional communicators and as partners to a lot of our clients to make sure that we're constantly bringing things back to that North Star.
May I yes and you for 1 second, Danny? Because one
Sure.
thing that I feel like in the last this calendar year, at least conversations you and I have had separately, are around how interesting it is, the influence of earned media and PR sort of coming back around in a way that is really, really meaningful, because I think due to the proliferation of channels, there's this resurgence of everybody has to think in headlines now. You have to think in headlines, whether you're trying to convey your message in a meeting, whether you're conveying your message to your board or your employees, or if you have to be so succinct and simple. And I think that's something that you've talked about quite a lot that's resonated with me. So I want to make sure that you get the credit for telling everybody to think in headlines.
Thank you for that. Well, it's so fascinating. And as a sort of dyed in the wool media person, I know James is there with me as well. We are older than we look. What's old is new, right? And so, obviously earned being the going back to the Holy Grail analogy, being at the heart of our business 20, 30 years ago, there's a resurgence because of AI and the learning language models. They are scraping websites and they're scraping press releases for that perspective on your brand that is pushed out there through releases and through earned media. So, and I think James, you made this point at the very, very top, having a real consistency and a real strategy around what you're putting out there is absolutely critical. Again, it
Yeah.
always has been, but it's that much more critical again. Decades after earned media really took a back seat to the digital revolution in the earlier 2000s. So it's quite fascinating.
I'm going to break the one chime rule and just weigh in that I was talking to
Keep it coming.
a colleague last week about this, about how to explain how AI works across channels and which one's most important. Is it earned media? Is it Reddit? I've heard your website has an impact. The easiest way I've found to explain this is those LLMs, they are consistency and consensus machines. They are looking for consensus. So if you only have consensus on your blog, you don't really have consensus. You need that consistency across all these channels. And that, to your point, Danny, is the think in headlines, but think if I could get the same headline in 5 places, I have consensus.
100.
Absolutely. Rebecca, I think you actually have a great case study to share with us on this exact topic around fragmentation and consistency.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we really love this case study is because it applies so much of what we've talked about today. And our aim is not to just point out problems, but of course to talk about solutions that we see and apply it in real life as well. So we have a client, a global healthcare leader, who face many of the challenges we're talking about today. They were fragmented across multiple brands. They were facing limited recognition, even though they were a leader in healthcare innovation. Their highly scientific offerings required clear messaging. And they needed that clear and compelling messaging to be able to engage their key audiences, which included researchers and decision makers, which in that space, is no easy feat. So, what we did with them is we went deep. We conducted brand and competitor audits and had those supported by stakeholder interviews and research. And we also incorporated our AI enabled synthetic audiences, which has been an incredible tool for us to have these synthetic audience focus groups. And this enabled us to simulate how key audiences would perceive that messaging, how that was actually going to land based on a myriad of data around that audience. And it helped us refine the messaging and uncover opportunities to shift perceptions and move them from a legacy industry focus to being that healthcare innovative that they actually are. I often say you want to show up in your external communications and marketing as the innovator that you are. And it's not just about where you are, but it's how you tell that story and what the core of it is. And the results from it were so incredible. They're such a great partner. And the approach really aligned business units and leadership. So touching on that alignment piece earlier from an organizational level, that's an important part of these efforts, is bringing those groups together to have their voices heard and align them on that one core narrative and messaging, to have that cohesion and have it reflect. In this case, we focus on having it reflect the advanced and transparent approach they have to healthcare. The brand launched successfully at their conference, and Highwire's media efforts also cut through. And that's part of having a clear narrative too, is it helps you you cut through all the noise because you actually have something to say that addresses a tension point in the market. You're not just a megaphone for a manifesto, if you will. And we help them achieve coverage that far surpass their KPIs and position them as a recognized healthcare innovator. We get to do this type of work with clients all the time, and it's so exciting to see that transformation from the beginning to the end. And, touching on what both Reed and James touched on as well, rooting that in an understanding of the audience and what's going to move them, taking it from that nugget at the beginning and seeing it translate into results is incredible and can really set the trajectory for business results as well.
Awesome. Thank you. It's a really good example of how all of this comes to life. All right, we're going to go into our third and final section of designing influence to work at scale. So as we go into this, we'll launch our third and final poll. Where do you believe your organization needs to focus first to strengthen your influence in B2B? So based on some of the conversation that we've already had today. Clarifying your core narrative, aligning marketing, comms, and sales, strengthening third-party validation, better measurement, influence, impact, better for measuring, and then preparing for AI, LLM driven discovery. Give me just a minute to finish answering here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. We are pretty flat across the board with all of these. An exact 18% for aligning marketing, comms, and sales, strengthening third-party validation, better measurement, and then preparing for AI and LLM-driven discovery. And we're at 27% for clarifying our core narrative. So it sounds like that's a good place for us to lean in a little bit more. So as we do that, Rebecca, I'm going to kick off with you around operationally, what systems can individuals and companies put in place to make sure that they are scaling consistently?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, honestly, I think we've touched a lot on this with some of our earlier questions, but having that clear narrative spine across all the programs is incredibly important. Getting everyone on the same page, establishing the shared messaging architecture, and that is not just that top of the umbrella, but breaking it into all of the pieces and components and bringing those experts together to be a part of that. I think we can all think of situations where that messaging has just been handed down from on high. You will get much better results when you're bringing all of the experts together to work on that messaging. You don't want death by committee or death by consensus, but bringing their expertise in to help establish that and version it, customize it for the medium where it will live. And then also, you can't, somewhere, a salesperson is going to smile at this, but you can't forget about sales and ensuring that they have all the assets they need to be able to carry the message. You can have the most beautiful marketing and communications program, but if you haven't translated that into the business of your business, which is converting things into pipeline and revenue, then ultimately you're not going to get the result that your business literally exists for. So it's important that you're taking into consideration what your sales team needs. And then we've spoke about it extensively today, but that channel consistency across paid, earned, and owned. There's a very beautiful and necessary thing about customizing your message for each of those places. But reiterating what we said a couple of times, the core and the essence of it has to be consistent to have that trust. A governance model as well. This can be a tricky thing. No one wants to be told what to do. No one wants to think that they don't have the keys to the kingdom. But the organizations that I've seen most successful over the years, like Google and General Motors and other companies like that, they have centers of expertise that own that narrative and help bring those things to life in really meaningful ways to ensure consistency across everything that their audiences would see. And really, also, it's important that you're never forgetting the global aspect. We work with a lot of global companies, and it's important that you're considering how that will come to life. You can have an amazing message that would really nail it in the US, but it will tank in some of your priority global markets. So you need to start with that global lens early to consider how it will come to life in other ways, in other markets where things can be how you speak about something in Germany is so different than how you would speak about it in Asia Pacific or in Africa or whatever, or in South America. So having that global lens early and making sure that you're applying it will help reduce the need for rogue narratives. Because when you look at your global markets, the rogue narratives come because someone felt it was necessary, that there was something about your message that didn't speak to the region and the audience. Translation is not localization. Translation is just translation. And so much can be lost in that. So it's important that from a systems perspective, you have that built into the life cycle of creating your narrative, bringing it to life across all of the channels and regions. Have that in place, knowing who those stakeholders are, where that clear ownership is, who's going to be that orchestrator to make that happen for your organization.
It's such a good point about there's a lack in message in some capacity for someone to feel that they need to go rogue. And so, Danny, I am actually curious, how do we do this at scale? When you have so many leaders who have access to their own platforms that have their faces and names on them than ever before, when you've got this message from a marketing and comms perspective that you want to make sure is landing to your various audiences, and then all of these different ways in which it can reach audiences even outside of the marketing and comms department, what are some of your tips and how can we make sure that that is staying consistent? So much of what we talked about today.
Sure. Well, again, what's old is new. I mean, it's strategy, rigor, swim lanes, consistency, right? So, and I think again, easier said than done, particularly when you have larger matrixed, complex organizations. But again, is it laddering up to this to the strategy? Are the right people in the appropriate swim lanes? Is the message consistent, right? And so, and are we applying rigor to, to the dissemination of information? It's very, very challenging. It's incredibly difficult. It's easy to capture on a page. It's
Mhm.
easy to present in a webinar or in a boardroom or within a strategy deck, if you will. But execution it's very challenging, and I think it requires that level of discipline and that level of rigor, and there's really no substitute for active daily management of that execution. And again, I think that's where the communications partners and the communications experts really need to flex, if you will, to work with the business to make sure that that's actually happening. When I've seen it fall down, it's when the communications has either been sidelined or not prioritized in the way that it needs to be prioritized. And then, of course, when things go left, we start all over again. So I would say again, those four areas would be my answer to that.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Of course.
Reed, I want to look at from a long-term growth perspective, the concept of innovation, of course, which is such a place that you influence our organization. So, how does strong influence enable innovation conversations, especially for long-term growth for brands these days?
Mm. What's interesting about this is I think innovation is such a big, like squishy word in many ways. And I think part of what we talked about this in some ways, but like in my mind, one of the provocative ways you can innovate in the way that you have marketing communications programs is to actually treat yourself as the influencer, because we haven't talked a ton about like what is the degree of people involvement that is required in order to be able to scale influence. Some of that you can look at it from the internal lens, like within our marketing and communications organizations, we have to be the influencer in order to scale adoption of a particular message or a narrative or an innovative offering that we were trying to like push forward into the market and demonstrate that. But at the end of the day, innovation to me in many ways is synonymous with opportunity. And we have a colleague who says something that has resonated with me a lot, which is that discipline is freedom. And I think we'll never have a lack of good ideas. And I suspect that the innovative tools that come out will help to generate more and more really strong ideas. And the question is going to become, how do you then distill and distinguish and then apply that rigor to how you actually execute? So that's sort of a long-winded way of talking about you have to have the structure that provides direction and guidance without being overly rigid, given the proliferation of tools. It's like the word of the day today for me is proliferation. But one thing that we have been building and thinking about a lot is how do you actually like bring all of the tools together in a way that's going to make sense and evolve with time. So I'm kind of scooping something that we will talk about as an organization in a few weeks, but I do think we will start to see one platform to rule them all that allows you to apply the human intelligence and the strategic operations with which a particular organization approaches an innovative problem. And then you can have that sort of layered narrative stack that allows you to tell the message consistently and at scale, where you're saying, okay, what is the way in which we build trust at the outset when somebody is doing that discovery, when they may not even come to our own website to explore an option or a solution. They may do all of their research within an LLM, which is something that James has spent a lot of time digging into, how people think in a new way. But it allows us we have to organize ourselves in a way where we build our own operating platforms and systems that allow you to say, how do we get the best out of what's out there in order to have that structure without rigidity to the way in which we go to market and tell a message in a resonant manner.
Awesome. Thank you. We already have some questions coming in, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to ask them now. I'm actually going to ask James one last question, and I think we've got a quick example. But if a CMO or CCO wanted to pressure test influence today, where should they start?
I think we're back to the same answer, right? It's can you measure that effect? Can you measure the action, right? If influence equals action. I gave that example of, are you opening my emails? Are you not unsubscribing? Rebecca's example of her friend from the ski slopes. Are you emulating someone else, or is someone else emulating you? Are you integrating sales enablement to the point where your sales teams are hearing buyers repeat your messaging back? Can we get that feedback loop going? I have a client who has a metrics report from us that is based on message pull through, and we look for message pull through for them. We also look at their message echo in competitors. So we look at, if we set the agenda over here, how fast and how aggressively do our competitors respond? So that is a good measure of, cause and effect. I put something out into the world. What do I see back? I think that's the ultimate. The answer is, do you have influence if you see no effect? The answer is probably no, but there's a million ways you could measure those effects.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, let's go into our last example, which focuses on a tool that we utilize.
Me again.
It is you again.
We talked a lot about AI and showing up in AI recommendations and chatbots being, tip of the spear for a buying group. We built a tool last year called the Highwire AI Index to give us something that we couldn't find out in the market. We could find lots of ways of measuring AI visibility, but what we couldn't find was a way of measuring it comparatively with a client and their competitors systemically and systematically through a funnel. So we built out this tool to highlight the differences, the deltas, as we go across, the awareness, the consideration, the recommendation and conversion, and crucially, echoing or mirroring as close as we can real marketing methodology in focus groups and aided and unaided awareness. Can I get the AI to tell me something about your brand? Cool. What does it say? Can I get it to recommend your brand when I don't ask about you individually? And if not, why? And who comes up instead? And what is the reference and the citation? So here's an example of us running through that process with a client today. We do this quarterly. And we identified a problem for them. It was in the unaided category, right? They were showing up really well. When we ask about their brand, the AI knows who they are. It has crawled their website. It learns all of their products and features and bells and whistles. But when we asked, what's the best product in this category? They were not showing up anywhere near as frequently or as prominently as they should, right? And we give extra credit for being in a headline or being bolded or in a bullet or being linked. So we use this to inform. In their case, it was around endorsement and amplification of those core messages that were fine on the surface, but just not repeated. They were not forming consensus across earned or analysts audiences. And then a couple of quarters later, we saw this pretty much flip. So you can see there the dark green is the aided, and the unaided score is the light green. We saw it flip dramatically, and now they are being recommended. And our tool kind of hits the AIs a bunch of times. Every day. I think it produces like 30,000 responses a month for any given client. So we're constantly pressure testing, and we want to see that kind of a result, because we see that as influence. We have effectively turned that situation around, and we're now seeing a good amount of traffic coming from the LLMs, not just the kind of the passive recommendation is turning into action.
Awesome. Really practical example. Thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. We do have a question that's come through. So if anybody has any others, please feel free to ask. But the question is on the question of rigor to ensure consistency. Why would that not be made much easier with AI tools? What's new is new.
I can take the first step.
Go, Danny. I'll follow you. I'll follow you.
The answer is yes, it would. We should be using the AI tools absolutely to create that level of rigor. But how good of a tool how good is a tool unless there's a strategy behind the use of the tool, there's rigor around the use of the tool, there's consistency around the use of the tool. Again, the tool, and I think somebody or maybe a combination of folks already made this analogy, going back to the laundry analogy, Reed. There are plenty of tools, but they're only as good as you use them, right? And as consistent as you are in using them.
And to kind of and that and take it to another level. So one of the things that I get very passionate about is that we now have tools or single platforms that are built on fleets of agents that are able to pursue workflows and methodologies and are trained on your specific brand in a sandboxed way that you don't have to spend millions of dollars building yourself and then find out that it's outdated as soon as an LLM updates itself, to be able to then have that consistency and have that editorial rigor where you can develop the content, you can have a human in the loop, you can then make sure that it's packaged for the appropriate channel in the appropriate way according to the best practices of that channel, and then be able to scale programs really easily and effectively and allow kind of the brain power of the people who are managing it to be the strategic thought partners both to their clients and to their internal stakeholders. So it's a brand new world, and there's a lot of really amazing things that we're able to do now. But I think one of the pieces that I really underscore over and over again is it's only as good as the input and the thinking behind it. So I do suspect you will see a rise of people that become overly reliant on agentic AI because it's easy and it's simple and it's fast, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% of the way to completion. So I really, my philosophy is we will all have to be why guys and spend a lot of time asking, why is this good? Why is this solving the problem of our customers? What is the kind of liberal arts model that you can apply here, which is like you can be trained for nothing but prepared for everything with AI, which is incredible, because as long as you have that strategic mindset and that critical thinking skill on top of whatever the tool is, you can absolutely scale things effectively and make sure that you capture that influence across the buyer continuum.
Absolutely. And centering your team around influence being a primary indicator of success and a goal will help you to keep a better look on AI and making sure that it has the right outputs that you need to support your brand. We are right at time. We thank you all so very much for joining us today. If there are any other questions that are coming through on Q&A, we will make sure that we get to those. We can get back to you individually, and we will have some materials that we will share after as well as a roundup. So thank you all very much for your time, and thank you to our panelists. Appreciate you.